Okay, so this is my continued commentary on chapter 21 of the Proverbs. I am in verse 15. It is joy to the just to do judgment, but destruction shall be to the workers of iniquity. So as always, we are going to move slowly through this verse. We're going to unpack as much as we can, expand the illustrative landscape. Making sense of things is a funny business. I often wonder how much sense of something I can actually make or actually have. And when I think about what it means to make sense of something, I have to wonder what that expression really means. For a sense is a bodily thing. It is a physical thing. A sense is something that we pick up from the environment. There are various receptors in the body that allow us to perceive such things. Such things as a tactile stimulus, or the weight of something, or the shape of something, the size of something. It allows us to see, to hear, to taste, to smell. These are all senses. But of course, language is not this straightforward thing. It can be sometimes, but by sense we can mean different things. I think there is some fundamental continuity between that physical sense, or at least our relationship that we have with the physical senses, to the broader or the expansive meaning of the word sense. When we say we get a sense of something, we imply that we are getting an understanding of something, such that our reason is almost like an organ in and of itself, like the eye or the ear or the skin. The heart is much like this. It is something that we feel like gives us sense. It gives us information about the world, about experience, about being. And when I say it's a difficult matter to make sense of something, in a sense, ironically, I'm saying that it is difficult to understand something. But I mean in a way as if understanding was to come to me through an organ just like my eyes. Like the landscape of mind is this intelligible sphere for which I interpret reality. I project reality up into that sphere. The experience of the world is filtered through my mind, and the result is the picture that I see before me. And so in this way, one must wonder what the sense of judgment is. That if I were to see judgment as I can see this book in front of me, would I be able to identify it as judgment? And I think the answer is yes. But there are many different types of judgment. It's easy to imagine a court in which there is a judge that does the judging. It's easy to identify a judgmental person. We can, if we consider it that we make judgments throughout the day. But all the same, there is a level in which we can consider a judgment for which my mind doesn't seem to readily go to. For I have the base experiences, the experiences that I know to be judgment. But when I consider judgment, I have a more difficult time discerning what it actually is. I suppose in some sense we can say to make a judgment is to have an opinion. Now, this opinion doesn't say anything of the judgment, perhaps, in terms of its rightness or wrongness. It doesn't guarantee rightness, perhaps, I should say. But even in opinion, there is some difficulty. For what does it mean to have, or to hold, an opinion? Well, in some sense, it is to hold an idea. It is to hold an idea that is in the context of something else, or in relationship to something else. For if I am to have an opinion, I can say that I like this microphone that I'm talking into. The microphone is necessary for me to have that opinion. And just like many of the verses so far, I have been centering my interpretation and analysis on relationship. I think that's where we have to begin, at that relational sphere. It is joy to the just to do judgment. Now, in my typical long-winded fashion, I'm somewhat displeased where we are in terms of judgment. So far, I've said that judgment is an opinion, and thereby judgment is something that must necessarily be related to something else in order for it to be. It's hard to have an opinion on nothing, for it is nothing. And so for an opinion or a judgment to be, it must be something. In order for it to be something, it must go through this process of having, of belonging, of connectedness to something else, a relationship. I'm fine with that, but there is something that I think is beneath the surface that I'm missing. Now, surely a judgment is something that we can arrive to, much like a person arriving home from work. It is not necessarily said by the person that they have arrived to their car when they leave the office building and walk to the car. It's not necessarily said by them that they have arrived at the nearest stoplight when they have left the office building. It's interesting that there are all sorts of different types of arrivals from the office building or work to the home, and yet what truly matters is our arrival at home. Our opinion, our judgment, depends on this. So I think here we have an added element. Or perhaps it is just a clearer aspect of an element already identified. Let's see. So for us to say that a judgment or an opinion must be in relationship to something else in order for a judgment to be something. Then it must be related to it. Now, what I've introduced here is attention. And attention matters. Because, as I've said, there are plenty of arrivals that we can identify from work to home. But the arrival that truly matters is the arrival at home. And so I think there is indeed an extra element here. It is not just the relationship that one must have to something in order for it to be, but also the attention that one gives to something, such that they can remove the various arrivals from the one that they are concerned with. So there is a bit of nestedness, I think, that we see here in terms of our judgment. Our judgment is shaped by where our attention is and by what we are related to. But does that say what judgment is? Or rather describe its aspects? But perhaps I'm seeing too much into this. I've had an experience the other day of trying to relate to somebody, saying, "I understand." And the response was, "No, you don't understand." And there is an interesting truth in that, and that there is an aspect of that for which I will never understand, and that is that lived experience for which the person is currently going through something. My response was, "You're right, I suppose I cannot fully understand, but I can appreciate." And by this way, I think we can say that in terms of analysis, we can describe judgment as a procedure. That there are inputs that are required in order for one to come to some sort of conclusion, that state of definitiveness, like the arrival home, for example, the filtering out of all of the superficial or unimportant arrivals, such that we can make that definitive statement. And then on the other hand, I think judgment lies within the experiential realm. For there's a part of judgment for which I am participating in. I know it because I'm doing it at this moment. It's very difficult to slow myself down enough to catch exactly when the judgment occurs because it happens so fast. My mind in the broad sense is focused on some goal. The goal is to focus on God. It is that ineffable beyond. And I keep on searching past, such that many judgments are made, such that my mind is carried through because of that ineffable. Along the way and along the experience, I pick up different bits and pieces of understanding and of information as I'm thrown into this reality, into this existence. And it is through the decision that I make to go after this thing that is beyond, that is the sacred, that is the holy, that thrusts me farther into experience and understanding. And so by this, I think that there's only a certain level that we can get to in terms of this analysis to describe judgment. The other layer has to do with the practical, has to do with the experiential. It is a joy to the just to do judgment. An interesting language there after I just finished what I had finished. To do judgment, it is the implication of that behavior, that experiential component. And here we have joy and just. Now, joy, I suppose we can say, is an emotion. An emotion that has arrived from doing. Doing, perhaps, is participated by either emotions or reason or both. It's interesting how complex the relationship of our experience is to our heart, such that if joy is the result of something that tells this manufacturer, this industrial factory that is the heart, to produce joy, this elatedness because of an experience that was done, we can wind the clock back a little bit and say, what was the mechanism by which that occurred? What is necessary for something to be done in the first place? What causes one to do something? And again, I had identified the existence of either a feeling or of reason or their union, such that this serves as the impetus, this is the prompting, this is the fuel that ignites that causal chain that would lead to an emotion that is more sophisticated than the base emotions. In the previous verse, I had made a parallel between more complex emotions that are things that are tied to reason quite firmly, and there are the more superficial base senses or emotions that are untied, unbonded to reason. We can have reason separated from emotion, but these things are transitory, I think, at least in my mind, much like the experience of man as he goes from work to home. These are transitory steps, not that they're insignificant, and it's not that they don't happen. They do happen, and perhaps in some cases they are very significant, in which we have a feeling that is unbridled to a reason, or vice versa. But there's a lot of intermediacy there that is interesting to reflect on, but perhaps it's not necessary in order to understand the bigger picture. It is a joy to the just to do judgment. Now, why would it be the case? Why would there be joy such that for the just, I suppose we have to understand what that is, who these people are, how they come to be, perhaps. If I am to say that something or somebody is just, what does that mean? I suppose we can say that they are good. And I could just as easily say, well, what is good? Now, from my understanding, I can say that good is not just something that is purely relative, though it is highly relational. Of the just, we are considering somebody that is morally right, fair, acceptable. And furthermore, when we say just, there are different components that we can consider. We can consider just in terms of the law that rules at the time, that may or may not be a true just law, and what is just in that situation may not truly be just, but it is just beneath the system that arbitrates acceptable behavior. But the implication here is that we are comparing the just to some ultimate standard of behavior. Now, a standard, I think, can be seen as a level or quality of attainment. It's something used to measure a norm in the clinical world, in the orthopedic clinical world, I should say, there are many orthopedic tests for which a clinician, physician, whatever, can utilize to help them narrow down a diagnosis. All of these orthopedic tests are sort of mechanical in nature. There are different positions that one may put a limb through such that it may be positive or negative. And based on the rightfulness of a diagnosis or of a positive test, there will be given to that test some relevant clinical value, because it is the confidence that we have in a clinical test will be based on the number or the frequency at which the orthopedic test is actually matching up with the diagnosis that it is meant to test. And so we have to have some better measure by which we understand what the diagnosis is. Otherwise, how can we really understand if the orthopedic test is right or not? Now here we have an illustration of level, because at the level of the orthopedic test, we are under a certain condition, a condition of absence of input, such that we don't necessarily know what is going on within a particular joint or the integrity of a particular tissue, but through different ways of assessment, through palpation, through, again, the orthopedic special tests, through perhaps functional activities, one can get a clearer picture of that which is unseen, which might be within the joint, for example. Let's use a particular example, particular diagnosis of a medial meniscus tear. We may do our tests such that we grind the joint. We may do it in weight bearing. We may do it when a patient is on their back and rotate the tibia in a particular position, and then extend the knee against that rotation. And based on that mechanical understanding, we develop some visual map within that joint architecture, for which we have to imagine that if there is pain in a particular location during a particular aspect of that motion, it is quite likely that the compromised structure within the joint is the medial meniscus. Now, this is all very interesting, because there are ways to determine with a greater degree of certainty whether or not something is damaged. And there is another level of fascination here, and that is to say that an MRI or just visual inspection through the opening of the skin and the joint capsule to look at the structure to determine if it is actually the thing that is causing the pain, or that we can understand from our basic visual perception that there is a compromised structure, or on the MRI, a little bit more of a sophisticated image. We can peer through many layers of tissue. At this level, the degree of certainty is much higher, because we are afforded a particular image that we are not afforded under the initial clinical exposure to a patient. Now, unfortunately, these measures are sort of advanced. There are expenses, there are limitations in terms of the number of machines that are able to perform these types of images. There are dangers associated with surgical procedure and infection that's associated with this. There's difficulty disrupting so much tissue to get at a particular vantage point to see into the joint and see if there's actually pathology. There's this risk versus reward scenario that we have to weigh. And again, I mention this because we're talking about a standard. I think there's a little bit more that I could say here about this. Now let's say, given the gold standard, I had compared an orthopedic test, this clinical tool, to a gold standard, like looking into the joint, visual inspection, or by an MRI. Now the question is, certainly there is a level, even if we could see that there is damage in the continuity of the structure, how do we know that that is actually causing pain? We can assume it, certainly, but we can also assume at the basic clinical level, without imaging, that there is an issue. If we just say that there's pain, we can say that there's an issue. It might be the most superficial level. But here, I think we can appreciate, once we enter into the domain, well, how do we know that what is identified on an MRI or by incision, that mechanical abnormality, is the thing that is causative of the pain? And in order to understand that, we have to understand the underlying physiology and anatomy, how nerves work, the position of the bones and all this sort of thing, and articular cartilage, such that we can get another map, a more detailed map. And the interesting thing is we can understand the map at that level and also understand the map at the initial level, again, without the imaging, without the eyesight to dive deeply into that system, to examine the nerves and examine perhaps the forces that are placed on that damaged meniscus in the knee to cause the pain. We use various maps at different levels to form our web of connectedness, and we understand at some level the interrelatedness of all of these things. But all the same, the thing that prompts us to ask the question, well, what about this, as we keep on diving ourselves back into that sort of depths of breaking things down and following something to its origin, we are trying to determine to a greater degree of certainty our understanding of something. And if we go far enough, we find ourselves in the theological territory, discussing things of the intelligible sphere, the sphere of the mind. And I think much like this relationship between the anatomic, that level of understanding that is beyond human perception, such as the physiology, the chemistry, the biology involved, and then all the way back up to that clinical level. If we imagine the just to be an occupant of the territory of morality, in which morality is this patient. Morality perhaps is a condition. It is the setting under which we identify and examine what a just person might look like. Just as in an orthopedic setting, we identify, or perhaps even we can just say more generally, a clinical setting, we identify some abnormality with a person, some physical abnormality with a person, or mental. And it is within the framework of the clinical purview that we make our assessment. Now, under the clinical purview, we have various tools, which I've gone into, which are these orthopedic tests, etc., etc. But I think all of this is grounded in our experience. It's grounded in our reason for doing, our meaning in life, our purposefulness. And that is grounded, I think, within that landscape or the setting that is such that we can examine and consider that of the matter of being, the nature of being. And I think the just and conceptions of these types of terms are quite close to it. Health is another one. Now, health has a broad offshoot which goes down that physical, and the clinical mind can often be kind of divorced of the broader picture because it's quite narrow and focused. It's almost a sort of an autistic view of things, if such that one was to view their world through a clinical eye. Or perhaps I should say only a clinical eye. So what's the point of bringing all of that up? How does that relate to it is a joy to the just to do judgment? Well, remember, I was talking about the just. And when we talk about the just, we consider people. Perhaps we are considering a particular person. Perhaps in my mind I'm considering a person that I would like to be, that I would want to be more like because that they are just, and I'm trying to determine the essence of this just person, how they are, how they behave. And so we've outlined a possible way forward. We have identified the landscape that we are in. We are in the moral sphere. We are concerned about right and wrong. And at the risk of sounding a bit contradictory, I think it's useful to use the toolkit that I had mentioned earlier, that map of seeing things at one level, but also understanding them from another point, another perspective. And since we have the A and B, or perhaps the A and C, we can infer to a degree the aspect of B. We may not have the MRI, we may not be able to look within, but we have the orthopedic test, and we have the underlying physiological understanding, which comes from a lot of experience, observation, a lot of information that has been proven to be true, such that it is, over time, something that remains stable. It is a pillar of knowledge. Well, the pillars of knowledge that we are seeking are right in front of us. There are the verses of this text. There's a lot of experience that is wound up within these verses. And the conception of the just, I think, comes to us over time, because we ourselves have to go through the experience of the verse, of going through the illustration, finding out what the illustration means. Even the word just in this verse has a particular position. We can identify its position in its relationship to other words, which have different meanings. And since we are within the meaning sphere, we can identify where the just is in the sphere of meaning. Or again, if we were to imagine in our mind's eye a map of whatever landscape that we wanted to imagine, we can say, I like to imagine an open prairie. Perhaps there's some rolling hills in this prairie. Perhaps there's a ridge line of a forest. Within this sphere, we are considering the good and the bad. We are considering the just. We're considering judgment. We are thinking about destruction. We are thinking about workers of iniquity. We are thinking about all these different things, elements. It is a joy to the just to do judgment. So what is our clinical test? Where do we even start? We have this desire now, and we have a conception that it is possible that we can find a way of being such that we are morally acceptable. Again, just as there is a way of being such that the medial meniscus can find itself under the pathological state. And by extension, we can discover and determine its pathological state by the various methods that I've outlined. And perhaps it's not just the pathological state that we are concerned with. I could just as easily say we can be concerned with the state of health, of integrity of the meniscus, in absence of that pathological state. And I say that because I don't want to compare the pathological to the good and the just. So let's try our best here. To the answer of the clinical test, I'm uncertain. But I think I must begin by some illustrative experience. So of the morally acceptable, or of the just that have some good moral standing, we are imagining the character of mind that is beyond that domain of the physical, or perhaps there is a relationship to it, but at a certain level. Again, this sticky issue of the levels. We conceptualize of this sphere, of the intricacy of the neural substructure that makes up mind. We conceptualize this illustratively, rationally, reasonably, often without the many of the components that are necessary to understand why, or perhaps how is a better question that is related to the substructure. The why is more appropriate, I think, to the mind that is downstream of the various elements that are articulating within the mind to produce the self. And we have to think that within this sphere, within our level, the level of the self, the level of the perception, or rather the conscious mind and the experience, that experience of selfhood. Although we do not see, much like in the clinical case where we cannot see into the joint without disrupting and compromising tissue, we cannot necessarily see into the substructure of, how would we say it, of goods that ultimately lead up to that supreme good, right? That intra-articular good, that thing at the top of the pyramid or the peak of the mountain, I think in large part this is, since it is sort of the cause of our intelligibility, it is much like trying to find the good in the word goodness. It is, in some sense, representational. The way that we experience good is to a lesser degree, but because we experience it on a lesser degree, we understand its existence. We cannot surgically open that intelligible sphere. We don't have the tools at this point to design a substructure that is sophisticated enough to really dive in and interpret how all the interrelatedness somehow leads to the realization, the perception of goodness, much like, or at least it is related to, in some manner, the perception of pain. We can understand this much better, I think, than we can understand the perception of goodness. Part of which I think is because there is no peripheral external to the mind receptors that are specifically responsible for carrying the type of information that the nerves that are at the periphery are responsible for carrying pain, for example. If we had goodness receptors at our periphery that integrated this sort of information from the environment, it would be quite interesting. But instead, we utilize information from the environment that's somewhat unrelated, or perhaps related to a degree that we don't understand, and then as everything is integrated eventually into this willful experiential being, then somehow we are able to conceptualize of this broader goodness, this sensibility that, as I've mentioned earlier, about judgment, the ability to make considered decisions or come to sensible conclusions. Now, much like the last verse, I had gone into this elaborate example about a road, the cars that are traveling from the heart to the reason. Sometimes the driver in the car is just a desire or a feeling. Sometimes it's just a logical thought that is concerned with causality and is not tied to reason. In both of these cases, they are quite unstable. They are temporary. They're transitory. They are the transjective travelers that are looking perpetually for a mate. And their mate is often reason to feeling or desire. When we have those unities, we find ourselves in a position that is all too familiar for us. It is the human experience. Many times our reason and our emotion are tied. In the long term, surely it is almost impossible to have a reason that persists without emotion, or an emotion that persists without reason. Sometimes, certainly in the pathological state of mind, we can have this desire or feeling that is perpetually persisting beneath the rational mind, but for the most part, in the normal everyday life, we experience the world through the union of these two aspects of our being, or our soul, our existence again. And I mention that because of the word joy, and I think it's important, if I'm going to continue this illustration, to incorporate this word joy into that. Now, the word joy is an interesting one. When I think of joy, I think of elation, I think of happiness. I think of something pleasant. It's certainly not something that is associated with negative emotion. It is inherently a positive emotion. But much like the last verse, there is a differentiation between an emotion that is tied with reason, which I had considered to be anger in the previous verse, that there is some reason for which one's irritability and oppositional nature is to be, And because of that union, it produces the thing that we call anger, which is commonly associated with an emotion, which is fine. But in my conceptual sphere, in my mapping of this, I'm considering anger to be this union between reason and more fundamental emotional or base emotional feelings, such as irritability or opposition. Antagonism we can throw in there as well. And it is not until the unification with those fundamental aspects and the rational that there is then this anger, because it's directed, it would seem. Now, of joy, the question is, do I believe that this is another one of these unifications, that there is something beneath joy that is more fundamental or elemental, that it is paired with some causal chain of thinking? Now, part of me feels as though this word is fundamental, but also that it is perhaps something that is not fundamental, and that there's a place further down that we can go, for which joy then would be a secondary product, not necessarily an emotional commodity. Now, there's another part of me that feels that joy is an emotional commodity, that it is at the base level. And for the moment, I would like to consider how it is possible that this is something at the base level. Now, there is another word out there, enjoy. Now, enjoy is something that I think is experiential. Enjoy meaning to give joy. Now, to give, this is more actionable than the joy. The joy is, now before I said enjoy is experiential, certainly joy is something that one can experience. Perhaps I should have said at the outset that enjoy is more directed experience, where as joy is the participation in that feeling or experience. It's hard to say exactly. Now, if joy is to be a fundamental element, that means that we cannot break it down any farther. And when I say that I am enjoying something, or I perhaps am joyful, there's often a reason for it. It's difficult to find emotions that are reasonless. Now, surely there are. And surely there are reasons for feelings that are beneath the awareness of the conscious mind. There's another important distinction, I think. Because I think that there is an aspect for which I have included the lack of awareness into that base or elemental component, and I don't think that that's necessarily true. That reason can exist beneath one's awareness. But again, I second-guess myself, and now I consider more that if it is the case that something is beneath one's awareness, then it hasn't been connected to that aspect, which is not just the reasonable component of the mind. It is that entire component that is the willful reasonable component. And I've discussed before that there is a willful heart component or experiential component, such that we can have a feeling that is for some reason, and it be well beneath our awareness. In case of danger is one of the primary examples. So I think I'm going to leave it at that it is possible that even if there is some reason, just like there is some good beyond our understanding for which we are trying to determine, as in the case with just and judgment, that we will call this force, this feeling that is beneath the aspect of mind that includes reason and the will that is born of that, or the will that exists that includes reason, whatever. But to get back to joy, it's possible that happiness could be subordinate to joy, such that it is one of the load-bearing components. Elation, again, is another one of those terms that I had used to describe joy. And if joy is one of those fundamental emotions that I talked about, perhaps it would be quite difficult to describe it. I see here a definition that is associated with profound happiness. Perhaps it is a degree of happiness. Now, degree or intensity of emotion doesn't necessarily mean that it is wed to reason. Deep connections, perhaps the likelihood that it is connected to some rational component in the case of deep connections increases, because connectedness, I think, reason and the criticality, the analysis sometimes is a great tool to have when considering connectedness. For sure, I am using it now to determine the aspects of joy. But I feel as though that I'm going to settle on joy being an intense form of happiness. Now, it could be connected to reason or not. I don't think it really matters at this point. It is a joy to the just to do judgment. Now, I think what we are encountering here is that filling in of the space between that difference that I had mentioned between the peripheral receptors picking up things from the environment for which the mind can integrate, and then there are things that the mind can perceive beyond the base peripheral receptors that seem to be beyond the scope of the rest of the body, that it is unique to the mind. And it is by the experience of joy. It's difficult for my mind not to fall apart here, because a person can experience joy for all sorts of different things. It could be quite wicked things, that a person is excited and has an intense happiness and, again, joy by. There's a sentence that I'm reading here. I felt shame that I had ever joyed in this discomfiture of pain. That's one of the literary examples of a sentence in which joy is used. But the action here is important, because what we are considering here is to do judgment. So this joy is the result of that reasonable process, that doing of judgment. Again, the doing of the sensible, the doing of that thing that is connected to what is good. Now, surely there can be people that are misguided, that do all sorts of judgment that are not for the good, and yet they find joy in their judgment, but perhaps it's not necessarily the judgment that they find joy in. The judgment is, for them, is a means to an end. What they really enjoy is finding things about somebody else to judge or to think worse off than they, so that they can feel better about themselves. Again, a wicked desire. The depression of one for the sake of the elevation of the self. But that is a little bit different, I think, from what this verse is saying. It is a joy to the just to do judgment. Judgment is quite basic in its conceptual form. It's not until we introduce specific examples where it can become quite complex. I think in the broad scheme of things, when we consider judgment, what we are considering is bringing that sense of mind that is capable of perceiving goodness, of morality, into the fore, such that it is more of an exercised muscle of the mind, if we can put it that way. And through that exercise, through that practice and experience, it is joyful to those who are concerned with goodness. Again, if somebody is concerned with the opposite, concerned with detraction and destruction, they are not necessarily concerned that what they are joyful in is not necessarily the judgment. What they are enjoying is the power that they, or the authority that they gain from understanding the map such that they can use it for their own devices. It's not necessarily, again, the same as using judgment to turn on the light of that landscape that allows us to see that which is good and allows us to make more effective decisions, allows us to be better people. And the experiential component that comes apart for the ride that is so important to our existence. It is the desire and feeling that joy is a thing that is, in some sense, an incentive, but it is, again, it's experiential. It allows us to be satisfied, content with the action and the experience that we are undertaking. It is much like the perception of pain, but it is in the opposite. It is the feedback, the feedback from the environment, the joy that the mind is actually picking up on patterns in the environment that is correct, that can actually be good and useful. And I suppose that there is an argument here that this is also self-serving, and what there really is no difference between that self-serving and the negative sense of self-serving. In a negative sense, though, we are making a different kind of sacrifice. We are sacrificing the good of others for the good of ourselves, but in this case we're sacrificing the unknown, or the ignorance of ourselves, towards the good of ourselves and the good of others. Now the second half of the verse, but destruction shall be to the workers of iniquity. Now I think this is getting exactly at what I just mentioned. Now part of the reason for this is that the workers of iniquity have to use that framework or the structure of the intelligible sphere in order to work their iniquity. It's almost it's a bizarre allotment. It is a bizarre permission that a conscious being is able to use the environment in such a way. But then again, if it is the case that this world and this reality allows such things like iniquity to be, then perhaps it is my conception of the goodness of the intelligible sphere that is a bit off. Now I've commented on this before, but at this particular point I'm not ready to go back there. So what do we mean by working iniquity. Now, iniquity, unlike the word that we spent so much time on, the word just, is almost the opposite. It is immoral or grossly unfair behavior. We could say that it is wickedness. Now, what exactly does it mean for one to work iniquity? We could say that in some respect, it can be the performance of the behavior. I think in another sense, we can imagine the network of relatedness, not only of material things, but of biological and conscious beings. That to work something into something, I think of an action like kneading dough, or kneading something into dough, or in the process of knitting or of crochet, we are working a particular pattern into that network of relatedness that is eventually going to be the structure, the blanket, the coat, the whatever. It is the thing that we design for our needs. It is the thing that we do to fulfill our purpose. Now, I'm not saying that the work of iniquity is to fulfill our purpose, but the work, I would say in general, is to fulfill our purpose. Now, if we sow and we work iniquity into that fabric, what we will have is fabric that has immoral behavior woven into it. And it is not so much that it is required, I think, of the blanket or of the jacket to have the immoral behavior within it, but it is rather possible, given the freedom of will, to take something that exists or can exist and then wove it into that fabric. Now, like with many things, the challenge in the Proverbs of these verses is to determine and connect and find some plausible reason for which we can get from point A to point C. And to do that, we have to sort of figure out what the way of point B is. And so in this situation, we understand, or perhaps I can appreciate how, or even why, in the case of selfishness, that this iniquity can be woven into the fabric of our society or of our relationships. The more difficult thing is to determine exactly how this can lead to destruction. I think there is an understanding, almost a sense of feeling of how this can be, but I would like to bring this more to the fore, of a greater degree of clarity. So, I've mentioned something of a web or of a network interconnected mapping of human relations. I think this map extends beyond just the relationships between people, but also to the relationships between objects, to other biological beings and other biological beings. It is not just a human-centric phenomenon. But certainly the mind of man is one of those useful tools such that he is able to appreciate the map that is set before him. There have been many times that I have discussed this idea throughout the Proverbs, and I think in fact that the Proverbs are prompting us to consider this map. We have a degree of autonomy to paint the picture as we will. Of course, there may be falsehood or we may be mistaken as we venture into that unknown, but that's part of the experience. I suppose there are a bunch of different questions that one could ask here. We could ask, does the sowing of iniquity on the part of man affect the things which he is related to? We can ask, how exactly does the sowing of iniquity into that fabric affect the other pieces, the other people within that network? We can ask, what does it mean for the worker, which is implied here to be a human being? But I suppose we can also expand that out fractally into things that are of or operate on top of human consciousness, but may not be necessarily conscious in the way that man is. It may have a movement that is beyond that of man again. Regardless, if we imagine one node in this network, and we draw one line from that node to another node, we say that they are connected by virtue of that line. There is that relationship. Now, what constitutes that line could be almost anything. It could just be something as simple as awareness. It could be something as complex as marriage. It could be a business deal or interaction. To a degree, it doesn't matter much. The point is that there is some relationship between the two nodes in question. Now, if there is an iniquity sown into that relationship, in what way does that poison come back to affect the node that had brought it forth? Well, we have to consider here what iniquity is once more. For iniquity is immoral behavior. Moral behavior has to do with what is right and what is wrong. And the questions of right and wrong are difficult questions. They are fraught with uncertainty, especially upon reflection of the human mind. They are, in some sense, hopelessly existent. That is, they exist out there in the world to be realized and understood, but so much of them lie beyond the sight of man, and it takes such effort to find them. And I think also we have to remember that rightness and wrongness can also depend, or can show itself, much like liberty can show itself in different forms. Its spirit can move through the relatedness of the nodes. And so by this characterization, by the imagination of different nodes being connected to one another, and potentially by their orientation, by the way that they are related to one another, we can find rightness and wrongness by that structure. And so the question lies even farther down, because we have to go into what is right and what is wrong. Well, if we are to imagine something that is right, what can we say of something that is right? In a rather simplistic example, we can think of a math equation. 1 plus 1 equals 2. Now, why is the answer 2 correct? Well, in this simplistic example, we have removed much of the complexities of the world and have just said that there are two things. These things are essentially in a vacuum. They are not related to anything else. And when we put them together, that they then become two. Now, there's an interesting Platonic reflection in here about two-ness and oneness. And even in this simplistic example, we can have two forms of a different kind come together to produce, or rather I should say two forms of a similar kind come together to produce something that is completely different in form, that is two, or the idea of two. Now, in the sense that we mean when we add one thing to another thing, its two-ness is right because it represents the aspect of connectedness between the two numbers or things, objects, whatever. And so in some sense, what we are considering here, at least in the simplistic case, as 1 plus 1 equals 2, that 2 is correct because it represents the correct relationship between one in separation from another one. When they find themselves in addition, they find themselves united into something that we can now call 2. Now, if I were to say that 1 plus 1 is 3, the statement would be false. But why would it be false? Why would it be wrong? Well, because the representation between one singular and another one singular is not 3. In fact, it cannot be 3 because there is just two things. And so I say it is wrong because I have misrepresented the relationship between 1 and 1. Now, in this way, if we are to imagine on a much broader scale and on a map or a network that has many more variables than that, we could take that simplistic example and say that if we have one person that is related to another person, there are certain things that we can say about that relationship, just as we can say about 1 plus 1 equals 2. Now, inevitably, there will come a time that we can say something, we may say something that is wrong. That wrongness, again, will be represented by our inability to accurately represent the relationship as it is between those two people. And we may be correct, or true, or right, if we accurately represent the relationship between those two people. Destruction shall be to the workers of iniquity. Now, surely destruction is the result of doing some wrong. For what is destruction? It is the breaking down of something such that a particular form can no longer hold, its integrity can no longer stay, such that it becomes dissolved into its component parts. The 1 plus 1 is no longer 2. Now the 1 and the 1 are separated. If I am to take this pen in front of me and another pen in front of me, put them together, I have 2. I throw one across the room, I can no longer have two pens. In some sense, I've destroyed the two-ness that the two can be together in such a relationship. I've reduced them in some way. And so this destruction is a form of reduction, but it is not just perhaps a subtraction, although that may be an element of it. We also, and we have to continue to remember that the form is the thing that is being destroyed. I could just as easily destroy the form of two by adding something to it. And if I'm concerned with two-ness, if my perspective wants and desires that two-ness, if I remove or add something to it, I have destroyed the aspect of two-ness. And so here we have two opposites. We have addition and subtraction. And so we cannot say that one or the other is causative. Well, certainly they play their role in causative, but alone they are not causative. They, in and of themselves, are not a principle. They operate by some deeper principle for which they disrupt the two-ness that is our primary concern. And so for what reason does the addition and subtraction disrupt the aspect of two-ness, or the form of two-ness? We can say that it changes it. But of change, I'm not necessarily sure I can say that we can qualify that as being something that is good or bad. There can be plenty good types of change, as well as there can be plenty of bad types of change. And so we have to say that it is a particular type of change. And this is where I think relevance comes into play here. This is where representation comes into play. Because as soon as we change our focus, or perhaps zoom out a little bit, and we find that one and one, although they make two at a certain level, if we zoom out, we see that they are each one in singular is connected to another one. Perhaps they're connected to two ones. We have 6 now that are formed instead of 2. And we can continue that fractalization indefinitely. And perhaps we can even go down indefinitely. It's difficult to say. For how does one disrupt oneness? Well, we fractionate it into a decimal. Even in the absence of oneness, we can continue to imagine a quantity associated with that absence. It's a bit bizarre, that negative. But I would like to posit something a little bit different here. I'm not entirely sure that we would say that on this example of zooming out, that the one and one, as we find perhaps in this romantic story about two singular beings coming together, if we zoom out and we examine all the different connections that each individual has that brings into that relationship, and we say, well, it is not just those two that are involved in this story. Perhaps it is a whole host of people that were involved in the development of the two that we see before us. Now, in some sense, we can continue to think about the two, that romantic pair, but we can also think about the relationships that were necessary for the formation of two. Now, just because we can imagine the number of relationships, we don't necessarily say, or I should say the number of significant relationships, we don't necessarily say that the two-ness was destroyed because that there is just more, there are more connections than just those two. It is a particular type of connection that allows us to maintain that identity of two-ness, of the interrelatedness among those two individuals, perhaps that are in love. However, we can say of a destruction in that two-ness, perhaps, again, this is highly conditional. We can say by the quality of the addition or the quality of the subtraction that there may be destruction. Otherwise, we can say that it was generative or creational. But by virtue of the destructive, of the bond breaking, we imagine those forces that come in to bind themselves to the singular nature, such that the dual nature in consideration can no longer be. And it doesn't necessarily mean that because of the relatedness of one to the other, that when the bond breaks between the two of concern, that then the one singular must necessarily be concerned or thought of in relationship to that other singular or group of things that had disrupted the bond of attention, the bond of concern. Destruction shall be to the workers of iniquity. So iniquity, we remember, is immoral behavior. It is wrong behavior. Wrong against some standard by which man has difficulty seeing, though he has the perception to find truthfulness. This wrongfulness bleeds down into the way that he sees the world, the way that he interfaces with it. Within his conceptualization of what is right and what is wrong, he finds that how things are related come to be his litmus test or his security by which he may come to know the truth or if he may be mistaken about something. And further, if one is to follow this wrong path and to be mistaken about the nature of things that are related to one another, he will misunderstand that which he sees. And why is that important? Why does it matter if one misunderstands what he sees? Well, if he misunderstands what he sees, he will inevitably form an opinion or an attachment to that which he sees that will then also be false, because it is tied and bonded to something that is not true or wrong. And if he continues down that path of bondedness to nothing. Then his framework and structure of seeing the world and of reality will itself be wrong, because it's based on a connected or perceived connected network of false relationships. And so that when this person goes to act, their action will fail, because there is nothing to bind it. There's nothing to hold it. And so when this carries on long enough, when there is a false conception built on another false conception, built on another false conception, all the way down the stream, I think necessarily there is a lot of weakness. Now, of course, in the human context, there are things for which he will identify that are true, just by virtue of his physical makeup. It's very difficult to run through life a complete delusional being. People, even with severe genetic defects, I think can somewhat participate in the world. Some can't, but some can. And by that I mean they can reach out and grasp for things and bring it to them. They can stand up and they can walk. A lot of this involves truthfulness. There has to be a lot of understanding that takes place, albeit much beneath what we might consider to be the willful, directed sense of the human being, but nonetheless, there has to be a lot of truthfulness understood at some level, such that the body can move through the world, that there is information that is being processed in a correct manner. It is correctly related to the way that things are. Now, certainly there are conditions out there in which a person may perceive something to be in front of him, where in fact it may actually not be there, and his interaction with the physical sphere in front of him may be off. He may be reaching for an object that's not there, maybe hallucinating, hearing voices that are not there, etc. And much like the schizophrenic that has difficulty adjusting to the world because of all the various false inputs that are produced by the mind, what we are prompted to consider here is that the workers of iniquity, although they are not, they might be, but I think we're thinking of people that are non-pathological in this case. But I suppose that we can say that they're pathological to a certain degree. It's kind of a tough one to say, but these workers of iniquity, they are not the schizophrenic types. They are the types that have a mind that can function normally, and they are producing these false relationships. Whether willfully or not, because of the wicked, I think it can go either way. Whether willfully or not, they do so. And because of that weak foundation that's not built on anything, they are unable to stand upon that foundation. And so they crumple. They cannot be righteous. They cannot stand tall. They have no foundations for which they can stand on. And those foundations, that are many, are undoubtedly built upon representation and also the connectedness between the various elements. Again, I think of the simplistic example of the 1 and 1 that makes 2. the destruction of that form such that the one and one can no longer form two. Not necessarily that the one and one have changed their relationship to become three or four, but rather that two can no longer be formed at all. That is quite consequential, because it can no longer be seen. If it can no longer be seen, then it doesn't exist. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that if something is not seen by the eye of man, that it doesn't exist. But if there's something fundamental to man for which he is able to see but he is unable to, for whatever reason, because of his decision or because of some unfortunate defect, then surely the absence of those fundamental components, much like the building of a house on weak foundations, if that is not taken into consideration, the house will fall. And so in this way, destruction shall be to the workers of iniquity. The man that wanders out of the way of understanding shall remain in the congregation of the dead. Okay, so we have another potential here for some interesting imagery. So we have to, I think in the first instance, imagine ourselves, I want to use a familiar illustration here. Imagine ourselves in an open field. I think of a farmland that has just recently been harvested. So there's a lot of open land. In the middle of this land, I like to think about a large pole that juts up into the sky. Off of that pole, we have a singular, we can say it's a lamp, or we could say it's just a dangling light bulb. It doesn't really matter. Let's just say it's a lamp. Perhaps it's a rather stylish lamp, so we can, who knows, appreciate it. But it doesn't really matter. This lamp is the only thing in the surrounding area that illuminates that surround. There are no stars. There is no sun to light up the moon at night, and indeed we are at night. It is just this lamp. And so we can imagine and we can appreciate the level of darkness here. And we can also appreciate that the lamp can only illuminate so far into the sphere, into the landed sphere, perhaps we could say. It doesn't mean that there is no land beyond the light. It just means that the light does not permeate past a certain point. And so what we can say is that within this light, or the illuminated sphere, we have what is called understanding. And the question is, of course, okay, so we have this illustration of light that is surrounding the area. How does this possibly represent understanding? Well, I've taken the word literally before, and I've said that understanding is a prompting to consider what is beneath our feet. The word standing and the word under, it is asking us to think of what is beneath that which we are standing on. And much like the last verse, foundations come to mind here. and that if you're standing on unfirm foundations versus solid foundations, we can imagine that the unsolid would lead to our failure, and the solid would lead to our success or prospering. Now we get caught in the variables, because there are many things I think that go into play in terms of one's failing and one's prospering. It's not immediately clear, even though that we have broken down this word, much like the previous illustration of the light. Well, what is the light? What are the firm foundations? The man that wanders out of the way of understanding shall remain in the congregation of the dead. Now this understanding, this light, these principles, I don't think we need to go too far out of our immediate experience. In front of me, I see the Bible. It is sitting on a reading stand. On the reading stand, I have a portable light that sort of curves up around it and illuminates the book. What does that light do for me? What does it allow me to do? Well, certainly it allows me to see. But sight in and of itself, I'm not sure, would satisfy what we are after. Sight and understanding, to a degree, it's vague, but I think to a degree there is some understanding. There is a recognition of something that is true. That there is a relationship between my seeing and my understanding of that which is in front of me that is actually reliable. That is actually not wrong. Now, when we introduce language into it, it's much more complicated than just the physical object that's in front of me. But even the physical object is not as simple as that, because I only see one level. And if all I were to consider was the level that I can interact with immediately, like turning the page. Now, when I turn the page, I have some effect on the underlying substructure, the material that the paper is made out of. But when I touch it, it's not as though my relationship to that material or that structure erodes it. It's not like it sets it on fire. But insofar as I can see, although it's not perfect, although I may say it's restricted to a certain level of understanding, despite the level, there is understanding in there. And so if we are to avoid the trap of talking about the level, and we are just to focus on the level that there is some understanding at all, that at the level of my experience, perhaps I can say, not even looking at this book, of being a conscious being, and being a participant at one particular level or layer of reality. What does it mean, then, for me to understand? Well, we have to go back to that illustration. We have to go back to the light analogy. When light comes in at my level, I am able to perceive the words in the book. I'm able to perceive the book itself. And because of my perception, I am able to participate in it. And because I am able to participate in the things that I can perceive and appreciate, then I am related to it, but it's not just related to it. I am related to it in such a way that it is right. It is not incorrect. Now again, for the example of the book, the physical book, it's much easier. When it comes to words, it's much more difficult because there's a lot of interrelatedness that's involved there. But again, despite the random and the interrelatedness, underneath that light on that open farm field, I have relationships that are, to a degree, certain. And if I were to walk towards the periphery of this light, just as it ended, and I were to step outside of that, I would be surrounded by darkness. There would be no way in which I could determine where I am in relationship to something else. Now this example is the only example that includes, this example only includes sight as that source of information to the mind. We are ignoring every other type of input. And so it's as if I walked outside of that light. It's not as though the earth continued, although it does. To my perception, it doesn't. And so we can imagine, I think we can appreciate that as I move outside of this light and into that periphery, I am no different than one that is dead, because my mind cannot take in information. It cannot form relationships. It cannot understand. There are no principles upon which it can support existence itself at the level that it is created to be, or related to be. Now today is a new day, so as always it will take a little bit of time for me to regather my thoughts here, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about the congregation of the dead. It's an interesting sequence of words. It's not not just a basic population of the dead. It is not the dead. It is the congregation of the dead. Now there are a few different ways that we can approach this word congregation. From its roots we have the meaning to herd together, to collect in a flock, swarm, assemble. As a noun, referring to an assembly, togetherness, union, society. But it's not until around the 12th century, with the French introduction, or the French imposing meaning or adding meaning into the word, in which we have the maintenance of the original sense in the sense of gathering, but also the introduction to more religious specific contexts. And by the late 14th century, in Middle English, the religious association was solidified even further. During the Protestant Reformation, it was used to emphasize the community aspect of believers gathering and worshiping. In the modern context, modern definition, we have a local society of believers within a particular religious denomination. A shared faith. And so from this, there are those two paths. There is the one that is not necessarily associated with religion, but then again, how can it not be if people are to come together, if they are to come in some form of union, there is a religio aspect. Now, I suppose if we are to say that a religion is something that is organized and explicit, then perhaps people can come together that are bonded for reasons that are made known but not institutionalized in the way that religion is or can be. And then on the other case, we have a specific reference of this congregation that is tied to that organized religious substructure. And so we have to consider how this is meant in the context of the verse. Are we to refer to the original Latin when we are thinking about a herd or a flock or some people that are bonded together, or are we to consider this a congregation in the religious sense, or perhaps more precisely in an organizationally religious sense? The man that wanders out of the way of understanding shall remain in the congregation of the dead. So again, this congregation, between each individual, there is something that binds them together. That binding we can call the religio, that term that describes the thing that unifies, the bondedness, the thing that is reverential, the thing that unifies. Now, the thing that unifies can be fairly superficial. If it's superficial, the bonds that it creates is weak. If the bonds are strong, or if the principles by which people are united are strong, then the bonds that are formed between them will be strong. In either case, it's an interesting statement to say the congregation of the dead. My mind goes in two places here. We can consider the dead in the absolute sense, in the sense of man's experience after he dies, after his body dies, then there is no more. There is nothing left of his experience. That aspect of him has finished to exist. His existence has finished. And so it's almost a contradiction to say a congregation of the dead, because the only thing that binds them together is the fact that they are dead. And perhaps that is one of the strongest binding factors. But in and of itself really isn't much of a binding, because for they themselves, they are not involved in the experience of that binding. So it's a strange, humorous irony in this verse, at least it would appear to me. The man that wanders out of the way of understanding shall remain in the congregation of the dead. Now, we've seen this before, this sort of analogy. We've seen it in the Psalms, as the psalmists mention the pit of Sheol, this darkened pit, that in some sense I think can also be paralleled to hell, but this place is a place where both the living and also the dead can go. And they share this quality, the living, in the sense that they turn into these zombies without guiding principles, without the ability to see. They exist within this darkness. Their existence is almost like that of the dead, just something that is nothing. It is an experience that is perhaps of another. And I think of slavery here, but even slaves, I think, may not necessarily find themselves in a pit of Sheol, depending on their condition. When I think of the pit of Sheol, I think of a strong drug addiction or alcohol addiction. I think of something that has captured a person. And the reason that I brought up slavery, because I think that there are plenty of conditions for which that type of capture or control over a human being can come from their master. It just depends on where the master comes from. It could be, the master could be found in alcohol, as it could be in another man, I suppose. And since they choose, or since they are forced into a relationship with a master that is beneath the true master, let's say, there is this dulling effect. It is almost as if the light that filters through the mind of the slave owner, perhaps, or the master, the distorted image that the slave gets is the image of the world that he sees. He's not able to reach out and touch it for himself, but rather only in a silhouette type format. And in the case of addiction, his experience is burdened, and it is darkened by the inhibition that is offered by the substance that he consumes. And in extreme cases, he is so inhibited that his experience is, again, much like a zombie. It is a living thing that moves and eats and maintains its existence, but it is only surface level. It's like an animal. There is no self-reflection. There is no reason. He that loves pleasure shall be a poor man. He that loves wine and oil shall not be rich. Now this is a good verse. And I say that it's a good verse because I think that this is something that I struggle with in particular. I have no shortage of opportunities to seek pleasure. There is so much information out there that is available on the internet for which one can satisfy their curiosities and their desires. And the mind can find itself in such a place that it is willing to accept that quick stimulation. It'll sacrifice its valuable time and experience so that it can be pacified by something simple, by something we might say is pleasurable. Much like consuming a sweet treat or a dessert. And we could speak no end to the physical process that occurs in the brain for this to be addictive to a person. I really don't think that realm really matters all that much here. We can do plenty without it, but it is an interesting thing to reflect on and to learn. I think this word pleasure deserves some thought. For what is it that I find pleasurable? What is it that this verse is implying when it says pleasure? Surely it should be the case that what a faithful person ought to do is to orient themselves such that the things that they find pleasure in are geared towards that divine logos, rather than the satisfaction of the immediate and of the egotistical. He that loves pleasure shall be a poor man. But perhaps even that distinction, the twisting of the word pleasure into something that can be more than just the superficial desires and things, and shifting that meaning into things that are much more difficult, perhaps long-term, not immediately gratifying. Perhaps we can't call this pleasure. Now, of course, the two are just thoughts. My mind is leaning towards that we can consider pleasure in both domains. For what we say about pleasure really depends on how we reduce the word. Now, if we don't reduce it at all, I think this verse is difficult to make sense of because of the possibility of pleasure actually being a good thing, rather than being associated with the perpetual impoverished state. So, like many times, I'm interested in pursuing the etymological chain, usually beginning in something like Latin. In this case, the Latin root meant to please or to seem good, to satisfy, to content. And what I see here that these terms did indeed carry a broader sense of satisfaction that is beyond just physical pleasure, and included things like intellectual and emotional gratification. But perhaps there is a way of seeing pleasure in a negative light that would shine. Perhaps I should say, if we see things through a positive light, just as I see my book in front of me, there is a reading light that extends over it. At some point there is a shadow. The light cannot penetrate through the book. It does not penetrate behind the reading stand. What is illuminated is what I am concerned with, is what I am paying attention to. It doesn't necessarily mean that whatever the light shines on is a good thing, but it also doesn't mean that whatever the light shines on is a bad thing. But what we know for certain is two primary things that come to mind. That what we shine the light on is what we pay attention to. And in the second instance of the things that we pay attention to, there will always be an aspect for which that shadow, that darkened shadow, is cast. And so, I mean this to say that even though there is this line that is brought up about physical pleasure, and I think it is often the thing that probably comes first to mind when reading the verse, that physical pleasure can lead us to all sorts of difficult situations. And yet physical pleasure is something that is unavoidable. We may be pleased to a degree by relieving ourselves by going to the bathroom, for example. It's a very typical everyday sort of thing. Now, we wouldn't really necessarily say it's a pleasurable experience. But in the reduction, there is this sense of physical pleasure, that what is pleasing is the release and the relief of the inputs that were going to the brain that were telling it that there was a full bladder or the bowel is ready to go, whatever the case might be. In the case of hunger, pleasure can be from a food that is being eaten. It may not be a particularly delicious piece of food, such that it is designed to stimulate the senses, but by the same token, if we are hungry enough, there are many things that appear to us to be delicious, and by extension pleasurable. And with the other terms here that were implied, that it is not just physical pleasure, but also intellectual or emotional gratification. Now, surely there can be things about the intellect that are satisfied, that are improperly so, and there are things about the emotions that may be properly pleased or satisfied that are improperly so. And so this sort of pattern I've noticed has come up multiple times here in the Proverbs. And this is sort of a Platonic reflection as well, that it is almost impossible to have a thing without its opposite. He that loves pleasure shall be a poor man. Now, the evolution of the word pleasure, I think, evolved into the enjoyment of the physical experience, of food, of music, generally of sensory experience. Or perhaps emotional gratification. So one has to wonder, out of all the variability of the good and the bad, what can we say about what we find pleasing? And how can we determine if what is pleasurable to us can lead to poverty? And so there's something that I would like to rule out here, so I can move on. The question of, can it be that there's an aspect of pleasure in and of itself that leads to a state of poverty? And then, by extension, well, what do we mean by a state of poverty? Because there are plenty of ways in which a man can be impoverished. He can be impoverished monetarily, he can be impoverished socially, physically. Out of all of these things, I think we aim to see the highest, or we see and we wish to identify those that can be seen as the highest, and yet are improperly placed. So along this line, there are three fundamentals that I would like to explore here. Fundamentals of the word pleasure. Now, one of them is to please, which is not all that helpful. Satisfaction, and to seem good. Of satisfaction, we can think of to fulfill. We can think of something that produces a peaceful state or contentness in a person, which is, can by extension, can be seen as a state of happiness. But I want to focus on the word fulfill. That comes from reflecting on the word satisfaction, or to be content. What does it mean to be content, or to be fulfilled? What exactly is filled, such that we what? the matter of being fulfilled or being happy, there are countless times when I have been asked, "Are you happy?" Most of the time, my inclination is to say no, but I think most of the reason for that is I have no idea what it means to be happy. And that doesn't come from a place of self-denigration. There's an aspect of me that really doesn't understand what it means. But I think that there is a key in the word fulfill or fulfillment. And again, the question comes up to me, well, what is being filled? What is being filled full? Fulfillment. Now, if I have a glass and I fill it up with water, the glass is fulfilling a purpose. It is holding within it or performing a duty that it was meant to perform. Now, in order for the glass to understand that, it would be quite an interesting thing. It would have to have a will and an agency of its own, but assuming that a glass did have this will and agency of its own, much like a human being, it would have to understand what the Creator created it for. Now, it would understand in some of the marginal situations that it can be used for many different circumstances. Different glasses of different types are used for different things. Many of them, though, by and large, are used for drinking. The type of liquid that can be put into these glasses can be variable. Perhaps the righteous among the glasses will only permit them to be filled with water because it is the substance that each person truly needs. Everything outside of that is extra, is not necessarily needed to sustain. The whole purpose for drinking fluid is to get water, get H2O for various biological processes in the body. And if a glass was filled with something other than water, let's say soda, this glass then would be fulfilling a purpose, but it would be fulfilling a purpose with some addition, that what it holds is a liquid and therefore it satisfies it. But it also holds this sugary beverage, which can be harmful for the maker. The maker that had designed the glass to hold what it wished to hold. Now, of course, the maker has the will to say, no, I won't drink that, of course, but let's say that the glass has decided, taken it upon himself to fill himself with Coca-Cola. This substance, no doubt, will have a negative effect on the person that drinks it, the master. And the master has no choice, because the glass has been designed and has a will of its own. And perhaps in this way man has a relationship like this to his master, and that his behaviors, the way in which he sees the world, the way in which he participates in it, is to a degree like extending something to his master. I think much like the glass that can be filled with soda or water, the human being can be filled with inattentiveness or attentiveness. I think one of his fundamental purposes is to be attentive, to, as in Genesis, to name the animals, to be stewards of the earth. And so again, in this sense, to fulfill is to meet some purpose. And surely, if man is to be governed by a just divinity, a just God, then if he meets and fulfills his purpose, which can be multivariate, no doubt, he then will be used for, and can be used for, higher purposes. However, if he is full of this, much like the glass, if he's full of soda, it may not be used by the divinity, let's say, for a higher purpose, for a higher good. It doesn't mean that there will not be those that in life achieve a certain level of prosperity in a material sense, and they spend their days perhaps doing some good, but also indulging in selfish behavior. Certainly there's the character of the anti-hero. But by virtue of that position, I think they can only travel so high. Their purpose can only be fulfilled to such a degree. I think there's a lot of intricate and interesting relationships that can be seen there. Now, I think part of the reason that this is interesting, that there are interesting relationships to be had there at all, is because that man is such that it's almost impossible that he doesn't have some pursuit or aspect of his attention that goes towards something that is not all that useful, towards a grand and broader purpose. Self-satisfaction in the base sense, in the sense of the superficiality, comes to us on condition of our experience. I've mentioned this already, but because our reward centers, our reward system, perhaps we can say, such that when we eat something it is pleasurable to us, such that when we have sexual intercourse it is pleasurable to us, such that when we fall asleep it is pleasurable to us. All of these little pleasures serve as incentives. On the other side of that, we can pervert it, and then we can try to maximize it to the extreme. We can find ways in which we overutilize our sleep so that we can continually get that pleasurable aspect, and yet at some point lose the purposefulness of sleep itself. We can see this either through extreme lethargy or through drug addiction. Food, certainly an obvious situation. There's a point at which food crosses that barrier or that boundary and becomes something that somebody seeks for pleasure's sake rather than to be fulfilled in the sense that they are nourished. And in the process of so doing, they also gain the benefit in that sense of pleasure, that eating something that is nourishing is pleasurable. But they don't go past the point, at least the righteous person perhaps doesn't go past the point of satisfaction into the perverse territory. And I have no idea exactly how to identify that boundary or that transition. It's almost as if it's so intricate, that relationship between the necessary and the perverse, that we are always flirting with that boundary. Now that statement, always flirting with that boundary, I have some difficulty with that because I don't think it's quite true. I think there's an aspect of it that's true, that is particular to the age that we live in, this age of abundance, post-industrial revolution. But the word always certainly was not the case. Even post-industrial revolution, there are plenty of societies out there, even what we would call first world countries or societies, that have gone through these periods of famine and war, such that what is necessary is all that there is. There is no time for that pleasure-seeking behavior, or the opportunity for that pleasure-seeking behavior to present itself. It is one meal when one can find it. It is kill or be killed. In that type of situation, it is a tough situation certainly for man to be in, but it certainly, I would imagine, would be an experience that would prompt one into heavy reflection, assuming that they can find the energy and the time to reflect on it. But certainly throughout the ages, man has found time to do so. Even in his earliest days, in the earliest days of his being or of his civilization, he has found time to write them down, them being his thoughts. But even in the extreme scenarios, when we are discussing necessity, it seems as though there is another side to this. That is, if we go far enough beyond necessity, we find ourselves in the pleasure-seeking territory. That when we consume more than we need, we are being gluttonous, or we are being greedy. We're being selfish. We're being excessive. But on the flip side, one has to wonder, in the case of extreme want or destitution, what is this? What is this that perverts the mind so that in cases of extreme hunger, that seemingly all pious matters and distinctions of human worth seem to go out the window? This possession certainly is not too dissimilar of the type of possession in excess, that of addiction, whether it be drugs or food. That the attention is pulled so totalizingly towards the want, the need, the desire, that nothing else can be accomplished, nothing purposeful can be done. And surely what is purposeful in a particular moment is the maintenance of existence, which would be consumption, eating food. But when the body desires, so much so that it becomes possessed by that desire, regardless of if it is from a state of necessity or a state of abundance, I think that this is wrong. This is a type of pleasure-seeking. This is a type of love of pleasure. Now my mind is continually saying in the background, well, how do you know that you are not being too harsh on those who find themselves in the experience of profound want, of starvation, of thirst? And it is not without sympathy that I approach this territory. But by the same token, I imagine those in history who have foregone necessity, such that they would prove a point. I think of Gandhi on his hunger strikes, that he was somebody that was willfully diving into the temptation of necessity, such that others would hear his behavior, would witness his behavior. Another obvious example is Christ. A man that is understanding that somebody will betray him, ultimately that he must be killed, must be sacrificed, that he must bear that burden, not just of death, but all of the sins of man. This, I think, we find the reverential in the abandonment of pleasure, even if it is self-sustaining for something greater. Now, in order to abandon the pull, let's say, towards sustenance, in the case of profound starvation, first and foremost, I should say that there are plenty that have not had the option of thinking about it this way, and that starvation would be something that would come to them and take them regardless of their desires. But even in our most profound cases of want or of temptation towards excess, however harsh it may seem, I think that the mind still has agency. And that is not to say that if I were to find myself in either position, that I would not succumb to the temptation, the draw of my mind away from what is purposeful and fulfilling my duty, just as the glass fulfills its duty to carry liquid and to nourish and sustain the host or the master. And surely there is grace there. There is grace within the most profound of circumstances, the most difficult that one can imagine. But again, through it all, the mind remains responsible for its purpose. And when I say that, it may very well be the case that a person that is starving, let's say, their purpose may be to maintain their existence. They may not be in the position that Gandhi was in. They may not be in the position that Christ was in. In absence of a higher sacrifice, then surely man ought to sustain himself. He ought to be focused on that endeavor. But once that endeavor reaches the point where he forgets who he is, what his purpose is, that he is a conscious agent, and that he does have responsibility to himself and to others, if in his destitute state murders another innocent person and takes from them what he needs, he then has become a lover of pleasure. A lover of pleasure through necessity. Just as one, I think of a drug addict, a meth addict, that breaks into a house and does the same and murders a person for their belongings so that he can go and fuel his drug habit. He is a lover, an extreme lover of pleasure. And in this way, this poverty, it extends far beyond that of the material that we consider. It surely will lead him there if he's to such a degree. If he doesn't find some even minuscule amount of salvation, he will surely wind up in that pit of Sheol, into that darkness. Again, the previous verse, the man that wanders out of the way of understanding shall remain in the congregation of the dead. He that loves pleasure shall be a poor man. I see not much difference. The second half of the verse, he that loves wine and oil shall not be rich. So an interesting transition. We have the love of two specific things now, two material things. Instead of love of pleasure, now we have explicitly two material things. And instead of the word poor, we have the word rich. Now on the surface level, we can say that, well, if you spend all your money on superficial things, like the things that will fuel one's pleasures in the material sense, that being wine and oil, then all the money is going to go towards that, and you'll have nothing for yourself. You'll have nothing for, well, suppose you spent it on yourself, but you'll have nothing for yourself for better purposes. You'll have nothing to spend on your children. You'll have nothing to save when you're older and unable to work. Now that's the superficial level. There was something that I did not mention about the previous verse, and that is of love. And I think there ought to be a few words recognizing the importance and the gravity of this word. For love is something that has a strong meaning, and it ought to always have a strong meaning to the mind of man. Love is a force. It is a type of relationship, in my estimation. It is a very strong bond. It is both wound up in reason and emotion. We can both feel that we are in love with somebody, as well as we can understand that we are, and verbalize that we are, rationalize that we are in love with somebody. And the irony about love is that it is subject to man's will, at least the love that he experiences and that he chooses to bind himself with. It is dependent upon his will. There's a certain amount of it that's not dependent upon him, obviously. And one needs not believe in some divine force to understand this to be the case. To understand that something can be, a love can come to him from an external source, from a parent or a spouse, whatever. But this love is a strong form of attachment. Here we are considering an attachment to a material good. And we have to ask the question, well, why does a strong attachment to a material good lead to an absence of meaning, essentially? Or rather, I could say, why does forming a strong relationship to material goods lead to an absence of value? Now, we've discussed the superficial sense, that spending all of one's money on material goods will leave one without. But that analysis ignores what it actually means to have a strong relationship to a material good. As if I had something that meant so much to me that I could not part with it, I could not live without it, perhaps. Or that I was bound so tightly to it that it limited my experience of life. I think about how bad real estate has gotten, how bad the cost of ownership has gotten in the United States. Owning a house or property, for example, is quite difficult. Owning a house is quite expensive. People oftentimes take out 30-year mortgages, sacrificing a third of their life in a state of servitude, not within ownership. Many people beginning this experience when they're already a third way through their lives. Now, property and land is not a guarantee in life, surely, but by the same token, if one is to consider themselves within a free society, within a society that believes in the rule of law, in a society in which law is intimately connected, I have to be careful here, but certainly in some sense, downstream it is connected by what is upstream, that of the cultural perception of what is truly worthwhile. And it seems as though if what is filtered down, what is allowed culturally or even legally, is this pervasive culture of delayed ownership, in the sense that what is doing the delaying is not the natural way of things. It is rather an artificial representation of the way that things are, and that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And it's difficult to do something for something that one considers to be valuable, and yet it is artificially valuable. And that by the culture's standards, perhaps, that people are tricked or fooled into believing that something is valuable when it's not. I think about money this way. Money in some sense is necessary, and yet it is a temporary thing. It is the wire through which the electrons flow to give us light so that we can read our books. We need the wiring. But the wiring perhaps is not necessarily the point of our existence. It is what we use the wiring for. And to create a bottleneck such that the wiring becomes the control, or the pin through which a select group controls the outflow, then of course we find ourselves in a sticky situation. And I think a little bit, not just on the broad cultural scale or even political scale, I think how this can happen within a man. That he finds himself believing in something so strongly, and yet he is so misplaced his value, the way he differentiates his value is so misplaced that his love, the strongest of bonds that he could possibly place and have in this world, are placed into wine and oil. Surely from there, these are mediums through which one can achieve a state of selfish fulfillment and satisfaction. And that richness in these terms is downstream of that understanding of what is truly valuable. And like with many things, the question is, well, what is truly valuable? And I think at the very least, this proverb is prompting us to consider that although material things are necessary for us to exist, if we form loves to such things, especially those that are not necessary for our survival, like wine and oil, we will not find ourselves in a place of contentment or satisfaction. We will find ourselves in a place of seeking pleasure, constantly seeking this pacification through artificial or superficial means. The wicked shall be a ransom for the righteous, and the transgressor for the upright. So the wicked, these are those that are selfish. These are those that are profoundly insular. They are those that care more for themselves than they do anything else. They, to some degree, are blinded by their own ignorance. Surely, we are all blinded by the things that we don't know. But these people are so inward focused that they cannot even see, perhaps, when a situation or an opportunity presents itself, that it would be something that would be worthwhile to accept or to pay attention to. Because the only thing that really matters is that inner monologue, that inner divinity, that somewhere in there is this special creation that is just of the self, that is constantly and continually, perpetually creating their desires, their emotions, the future of the experiences that they wish to have, so that they can feel, "He that loves pleasure shall be a poor man." The wicked shall be a ransom for the righteous. Now, ransom is an amount of money that is demanded by a particular party in exchange by the party that is demanding the ransom for something that they hold. And usually, in the cultural context, it is for something that they've stolen. Sometimes that this is referred to, or in the context of stealing a person or holding a person against their will. A quick Google definition here of ransom: a sum of money or other payment demanded or paid for the release of a prisoner. The holding or freeing of a prisoner in return for payment. And so the wicked shall be a ransom for the righteous. That if we can imagine that there is this cosmic arena that is in front of us, we have this wicked principle. We can say that we have all of the people that are wicked in this pot. Or more precisely, we can consider it in the form of the definition, again on the cosmic scale. But first, I'll have to indulge my scattered attention for a moment and take a slight detour and talk about the word payment, because I think it's necessary in order to get this bigger, broader, larger understanding of the cosmic image that I'm trying to outline for myself. Now, specifically, the word payment is not used in this verse, but within the word ransom, I think that there is implied a payment of something, as is in the case of the Google definition. So starting like most instances with the Latin roots, we find a meaning that is to appease or to pacify. Now that verb, that Latin verb, peccare, that verb stemmed from the word pax, which signified peace. Now the matter of satisfying or appeasing or pacification or even peace, I think, has been a topic of discussion. It has been a topic of discussion within this chapter. Verse 14, a gift in secret pacifies anger, and a reward in the bosom strong wrath. That verse I had spent a substantial amount of time on. And what led to the pacification in that sense, in that context, or in that verse, was some outside influence. It was the gift in that case. It was the gift that caused a change in relationship between the rational mind and the feeling or the desire. Now, anger, something inherently, is to be pacified because it is an unsettling, antagonistic relationship between the directed mind, that rational component, and the underlying feeling and desire, which we may say is irritability or just general opposition. And in this case, when we think of ransom, we are thinking of a broader word, but at the fundamentals we are still considering payment, and this payment has the end or the goal in mind of satisfaction, pacification, appeasement, peace, settling, coming to rest. That this issue, this dynamic issue, this tension that is created by the very call for a ransom in the first place, that through some means, again through this payment, that there is the ability for what clouds our vision, what leads to the irresolute becoming resolute, the uncertain becoming certain, the misunderstood becoming understood. So now what we are provided here are a few different, now my mind wants to say pillars, but they're not necessarily pillars. They're pillars in the sense that they are things that we can imagine within our mental landscape are affixed to some stable intellectual ground. These pillars are provided here in the proverb. Now, I don't mean pillars in the sense of principle, although principles are also pillars that can be these strong guiding forces that are fixed into the intellectual earth, for example. that are largely immovable and can weather the storm. This is not necessarily what I'm talking about. In the pillars here, I'm talking more of a guidepost, almost like a lighthouse, something that we can see in the dark or in the fog, for which we are able to draw out this map of relationships here. Okay, so what does that mean? Now, keeping in mind what I said about the payment and how this can bring the irresolute into a state of resolution, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the state? What is causing the irresolute to exist in the first place? Now, we know by this verse, we're being prompted to think about by this verse, that the wicked is and has this capacity to satisfy and resolve the issue that we are having. The issue that we are having is that the righteous are being held captive. And for this reason, we need some sort of payment to release them from that captivity. And I suppose we can ask two questions. Well, how can it possibly be that the wicked are the ones that are to be payment and to resolve the issues that the righteous are having? Now, the surface is probably a little bit more simple. It almost seems intuitive when we quickly read over it. Oh yeah, that makes sense. But on a deeper level, I think it's important to consider. It's especially important to consider in what way are the righteous held captive? In what ways can the righteous be held captive? Now, we can go through a bunch of examples, perhaps intermediate examples, we might say. But I'm concerned with the fundamentals, with the base of what it means for the righteous to be held captive, or to be restricted in this way. Of the righteous, we can say that they are morally upstanding. They are individuals that behave in such a way that, perhaps from a biological perspective, that their lineage, their genetics, persists through time. Now, there are plenty of ways I think that one's lineage can persist through time that is not necessarily dependent on good ethics or morals, but I think that there is a potential path that comes off of this, in which, in the case of the righteous and the morally upstanding, that their lot will be successful over those who are not this way, and perhaps even over longer time scales. Morality, I think, is an interesting thing, a discussion of the good and bad, good and evil. And one must wonder, as they peer out into the world, where do they find this morality? How do they see it? I suppose in some sense it's not as easy as looking at an object like my microphone or this book in front of me or the laptop that's beside me and say that this is morally good or morally bad. In some sense, at least I consider these things to be morally neutral. Now, if I expand this a little bit and I consider the context or the cultural place in which these items find themselves, I think the answer changes a little bit. In terms of who you ask, perhaps the Bible will be seen as a good thing, a good object, a good book. Again, depending on who you ask, this microphone that I'm speaking into may be recommended. It may be a good microphone or a bad microphone. The conception of technology and all of that association that comes with that. When we consider the laptop, there may be good and bad that comes with that. And by this we follow something. We follow a habit, we follow a custom. But these customs and these habits are ingrained in us. It is something that we live out. It is something that enters into us somehow, much like the light enters my eye such that I am able to see the book or the microphone or the computer in front of me. And in this third eye sense, in which we see the structure of the moral through our habits, through our manners, I think one can say that it is not necessarily the habit or the manner that makes something moral, but perhaps rather that this is one of the mechanisms or the mediums through which we are able to perceive of what is moral. Now, there may be customs or habits that are considered to be just or good, when in fact actually they are not just or bad. And the interesting thing is the shift and the change that occurs therein, and the subtlety that's involved there. Certainly man can be convinced of a lot of things, crazy things, perhaps murderous, and he could think all of this good. And he could think all of this good because of some habit or some custom. I was talking to a woman today who was reflecting on her marriage. She has been married for quite a long time, longer than I've been alive, and there's a lot of negativity that was wound up in that marriage. A lot of time of not reconciling issues, not bringing together, and instead keeping a unity at one level and yet witnessing disunity at a bunch of different levels. And when I think about this, I think I get a glimmer of that cosmic image starting to turn on, like one of those UV bulbs that you hit the on switch and there's this flickering before it actually is consistently illuminating the space that it is intended to illuminate. And this matter of level, that there can be a unity, let's say, of culture or custom at one level, and then at some subsidiary level there is a disunity, that there is some contradiction, that the unity above, or below perhaps, whatever, holds such that there may be some cohesiveness, but that cohesiveness cannot last, because what is unfolding beneath, or perhaps I should say that the cohesiveness becomes unholy. It becomes something rather than a bond and unification in which there is growth and development. There is this domination, this shackling, control. Now there is a person bound rather than a person united. In the case of the marriage, or in the case of a culture, I think of a tyrannical system, I think of the Nazis. I think of Stalin. I think of all of the kings that have come and gone, especially in the Jewish case. But in light of all of this, we can ask ourselves the question, what in terms of what is the cultural standard or custom, but we can also ask ourselves why, and I think the why is the more important question. Certainly if we are uncertain about the current standard of things, I think the question why is, although it is threatening perhaps at times, it is fundamental and important to explore. Even if the what is sufficient to satisfy one's desires of the why, the approach and the questioning of why, again, I think is fundamental to one's understanding of morality. So as we make this journey into the secrets of the why, I should mention that today is a new day, and with it, not as much sleep as I would like, but it is a weekend after all. And the weekends serve to be time for recoup, but also for productive leisure, which is something that I would consider this to be. And well, I suppose there's no beating around the bush here. Might as well just get right back into it. This matter of the why and the layers of the strata, the levels of analysis, the levels of reality that we can interface with, the way in which we integrate with them, and by our integration with them, through our relationship with them, we find ourselves to observe, to witness, to experience certain results. From these results, we may attribute positive or negative emotions, positive or negative outcomes. And the why is between, I think, our understanding and on the eve of our blindness, after which we don't know. We ask that question of the why right up to the point where we can conceptualize whether it be true or false. But the why certainly has to do with this complexity, the integration of the self to the aspects of reality that he can perceive. Part of this has to do with the technologies and cultural customs, as I've mentioned. Technologies of mind can progress in well past, I think, the point of otherwise limited experience. And, this matter of transcendence is no simple one. It's a strange one. When we consider religions as something, we can call them psychotechnologies, or I've heard them referred to as psychotechnologies. That it is a technology of mind for which we can expand that third eye. We can see into the landscape that is unseen with the two that are used for vision. It is the application of mind to see beyond that which the immediate senses are capable of. And it answers, I think, along the way, a lot of these why questions. Perhaps unknowingly to us, a lot of the why is answered, and our behavior is expressed as such. But I think of the dog that is sitting behind me. And sometimes I think about and I reflect on her temperament. She's a well-mannered dog for the most part. She is also being a creature that has been sculpted over many hundreds of years by man. She is not a typical dog. The relationship to that of a wolf is far from. Along with the distance between her physical features and the features of her wolf ancestors, the behavior, I think, is also quite different. Now, perhaps there are some limitations because she is rather small in terms of the capacity of her behavior, because of the intricacy of the brain, the size of the brain, but perhaps not. I often wonder this, but that's an aside. Of the behavior that I've noticed, there is the human hand is evident. In what ways seems to be difficult to point down at times. At other times, I find myself saying, this is uniquely human. This sort of thing is because she was raised by human hands. But of course, the human hand is not the only thing that has shaped her. There are forces well beyond the immediate that have shaped her, that leave her inevitably connected to her wolf ancestors, and also limited, I think, in terms of her behavior, capacity to communicate and relate to a human being the way that two human beings can. Both of which, I think, encompass a why, the reason for why she is the way that she is. Her behavior, her physical structure, her physical features, and the boundaries and limitations therein. Now, I'm often disappointed at aspects of my behavior. Sometimes I feel like I have done good, and at those moments I certainly feel fulfilled, I feel pacified, I feel at peace. And aside from the tricky situation of a good that is misplaced, a good that does harm to another such that one feels good about what they've done, set those situations aside. In my own experience, it's just not that way. I can be quite insular. I can revert to what we might call wickedness or selfish behavior. And I feel better when I focus on things that are outside of myself. Of course, they include myself, but I'm always involved in that experience. I'm running the software of my own show, my movie, after all. But I am, in my experience, my picture is a part of this broader movie and show. Of my more insular times, I find difficulty. I find that it is a stifling atmosphere. I find at once that I'm afraid, perhaps at times, to venture beyond, to plug myself into that which would take me outside of myself. And at times I feel that way because it can be rather painful. It can be rather uncomfortable to move out into the world and experience something, as one needs sacrifice to experience. And I struggle with the idea of the sacrificing of myself for that experience. And I suppose that is a form of wickedness. It's a form of wickedness that I recognize all too well, and I have tried very hard to rectify, to modify. And when I see the words, "the wicked shall be a ransom for the righteous," if we are to imagine this on the cosmic scale, that this may apply to a society as it does to an individual. I have noticed that when I sacrifice those selfish desires, or perhaps it may not even be selfish desires, because there's always this self component to it. When we say selfless, I think that it's not really selfless. There is the self that is involved in the experience. I think what we are largely referring to is the attention being oriented towards the self rather than oriented to something different. And when I find my attention to be oriented and flowing well with something else, something like Proverbs chapter 21, verse 18, that strange dejection, the slow creep of the melancholy, is placed at bay. Some of the more sinister forces that come up through times of inactivity, periods of fatigue, that there is this strong desire, this want to curl up into the confines of the self and go to sleep. And I don't mean literally, I mean this in a figurative sense, go to sleep as one would find themselves asleep in the pit of Sheol, in that darkened state where the mind is conscious but it is dulled, it is zoned out, it is watching a TV program, it is surfing the internet for something, it is eating food it should not be eating, whatever it might be. It is a distraction of sorts, but it is the attentive impulse to the types of distractions that would satisfy the basest and most impoverished, perhaps we could say, desires of the heart, without any concern for the sophisticated relationships that our experience can offer, without wanting or having the desire to integrate the base into something that is a strong fundament for which one can build a meaningful experience upon, even if it's short, even if it's just for a day or for an hour or for 5 minutes. And that within me, this ransom, what is required for that righteous man that is in there, that perhaps doesn't show his face all the time, but I have seen him, I have been with him, I have experienced him. The prerequisite for his existence, for his coming to be, costs my selfishness. It costs my insular nature. It costs that desire for the absence of meaningful experience. It costs my, again, desire for the base dulling of my attention so that I don't have to think about anything, because I had spent the work week thinking about things and now my mind is tired. I feel as though the fatigue and the experience of the week is sufficient, such that my mind can rest. And perhaps this is true to a degree, that my mind should rest. But it also depends on what it means to rest. If by rest I mean what I've mentioned, to find my existence, my attention to be dulled, to have my experience lessened, to have my understanding of the world as it has been passed down to me through my culture to take a back seat, to revert to some sort of animalistic existence for which I'm not all that concerned about the pursuit of righteousness or the experience of the good. I think the failure to accept that burden, or the failure to accept that responsibility, is part of the reason why one falls into that wickedness. For at least in my experience, I don't know how it is in the experience of others, but there is this call, if one listens attentively enough. Perhaps one can mistakenly call it anxiety, although it may be a form of anxiety, who knows, but it's this constant pull. That's why I called it a burden earlier, rather than a responsibility, because at times it can feel like a burden. It can feel as though that call is so overbearing in the presence of the impoverished attention of one that should be doing something that they are not currently doing at the moment. The wicked shall be a ransom for the righteous, and the transgressor for the upright. So, like many times in the Proverbs, we have an interesting melody that emerges here. We have the second part of this verse as a utilization of the prior. The wicked shall be a ransom for the righteous, and the transgressor for the upright. And so we can easily say the transgressor shall be a ransom for the upright. And the question is, well, why are they using two different terms? Surely these terms are similar to a certain degree, that there are similar qualities of the upright and the righteous, that there are similar qualities of the wicked and the transgressor. Now, if we are to take that word transgressor and discuss this in sort of a literal manner, to break down the word, trans means across, or beyond, or over. I think it implies that there is some boundary there. There's some identifiable thing that has been passed, that has been crossed over, perhaps that has been done away with. Then we have this word, the suffix, gressor, which means to step or to go. And so we have an indication that we have gone beyond, that we have taken some initiative, we have paid attention, we have identified something within our mind, we have identified a boundary perhaps, and we decided to go over it, past it, beyond it, across it. And what does that mean? Why is there a boundary? There are plenty of boundaries. There are laws. There are physical boundaries. There's a boundary between my muscle and the outside world, perhaps. That boundary is the skin, dermis, the epidermis. Surely there are plenty of boundaries in life. Some of them are artificial and laid down by man, some for good purposes, others not so. In those cases, sometimes we have to transgress relative to man's sins or mistakes, perhaps, to rectify them. But when we transgress the ones that are not set by man, the ones that are set in stone, such that if we transgress them, if we cross them, we risk annihilation, death, that we sacrifice creation rather than propagate it. These we change or we ransom in exchange for the recognition of those principles or those boundaries by which we understand must be firm in order to uphold a society, uphold a coherent self, such that he can operate in the world and participate effectively. To be a strong man, be a strong woman. Now, I'm sure this type of verse is going to come around again. Certainly the themes of the wicked and the righteous, the transgressor, the upright, this sort of thing we'll see again, surely. In fact, I'm looking at a few more verses. I see righteous, I see righteousness, I see wicked. It's all over the Proverbs. The reason I bring that up is because I think there's a connection there that I'm missing a little bit, but it's just not coming to me, so I'm going to move on to the next verse. It is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and an angry woman. Now here we have the return of the humorous irony that we saw earlier in this chapter. I'm trying to find it here. My eyes are scanning the page for it. Verse 9 of this chapter, chapter 21, it is better to dwell in a corner of the house top than with a brawling woman in a wide house. Perhaps verse 9 is a bit more humorous in the ironic sense than the verse that I had just read. It is better to dwell in the wilderness than a contentious and an angry woman. We are no longer in the house any longer. The woman has pushed us quite to an extreme degree to the periphery. And I think a conversation there is warranted about what actually that means. And to get past a little bit of that initial impulse towards the humorous irony. Now, throughout my experience of doing the Proverbs, like with any experience, there are ups and downs. I think about experience in general. I think about when I'm hanging out with friends or family, and not all of the time, nor is it all the time when I'm by myself, that I feel connected, that I feel engaged. Part of that is my own fault for not putting my best foot forward and being as engaged as I can be, but another part of that, I think, is just the natural way of things. We can't sort of keep the faucet open all of the time. We can do our best to do it, and I think it's not an excuse to, when we feel bad, not to do it. Or not that we feel bad, but that we feel disconnected or off. I think it's always a responsibility on our part to put forth the effort such that the feelings of dread, perhaps melancholy, perhaps dejection, this sort of stuff can subside. Now, I bring that up because throughout the Proverbs, the experience is much the same, although on a different level, because I think inherent to the Proverbs, inherent to any deep thought or a book that is geared towards wisdom, there is bound to be intense self-reflection. And down within that realm, within the self-reflective sphere, once we find ourselves within that experience, I think participating in that room, in that realm for long enough, we come round full circle, and we pick up where we had left off a previous time. We come back to a pattern that we had seen or covered before. And when we come back to it, sometimes there is this sense of monotony, perhaps, a certain aspect of tediousness, routine. And at those moments, they can be golden, because when they come, especially in the reflective sphere, we are prompted, we are called to consider, to break that apart, to find why this is the case. Often I find myself within that space because I have not made enough connections between the better and the worse. That what I'm often prompted to consider is that landscape, the visual landscape, the symbolic landscape perhaps. And within that landscape I see a lot. And I'm very appreciative of what I get from that experience of engaging with that part of my mind. But at times, like many things, when we try to boil things down continually, we come up empty. We come up sort of as a dog that is chasing its own tail. And it's verses like these, I think, that when we see the word better, it is a time where we should reflect, because now we have an opportunity to consider one thing above another, rather than just sort of considering the general landscape of boundaries, of the periphery of the limits, which those in and of themselves are good. But an explicit statement of better or worse allows us to take it a step further. Now, in my long-winded attempt to explain my desire and the importance to escape tediousness, I feel perhaps that I have gone down the road of tediousness in order to avoid it, but nonetheless, it is better to dwell in the wilderness. So in this statement, better, we are saying that one state is preferable. We are saying that one state perhaps is morally superior than another. Now this is where the irony comes in. We have better associated with a state that is undesirable. It is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman. Now, some people may ask, well, a contentious and angry woman, dealing with her perhaps in the city, I'll be fed, I'll have a house, a bed. But in the wilderness, I'll have no food, I'll be alone, I'll be cold, hungry. How is it possible that the prior state is elevated above the latter? Certainly both conditions are not good. So what can be said about each of these conditions? The wilderness, I've mentioned some of its qualities. The wilderness can be unforgiving. As of right now, it is February in 2024 in the Midwest of the United States. And it can get cold here. I have to say that winters have become more and more mild since I was younger, but it can still get cold here. And right now it is below freezing. And to find myself alone in the woods tonight, I think would be certainly difficult for me. I don't have very much experience in the wilderness. But if I were to find myself in such a place, I have to wonder what my experience would be, where my mind would go. Well, surely my attention would shift. It would shift towards my survival instead of shifting towards what I have going on the next day, perhaps, or enjoying my bed, my mattress, my warm sheets. The wilderness is also a place of uncertainty. The wild, unmanaged, uncultivated, untouched by man. We can say that it is uncontrolled, potentially dangerous. We can also say of the wilderness that it is a form of the periphery. The wilderness does not inhabit the heart of our cities. We may add elements of the wilderness, like Central Park, for example, in New York. It is large enough to appreciate the beauty in nature, but not large enough to the point where a person may be lost to society, that if they have an ailment that they cannot have it fixed. Certainly in Central Park it is large enough for somebody to get lost, but not for long. The wilderness, I think, is a necessary condition of our experience, even if we domesticate the wild, physical, natural landscape. The wild will find itself somewhere within our experience, somewhere within our society, somewhere within our city. It may not be Central Park. It may be in the heart of that concrete jungle. It may be in the form of absent fatherhood. It may be in the form of crime that results from it. It may be from corruption, of pollution, all of the typical things that we might associate with the wilderness and the wild of the large city landscape. And much like the plight of the Jews that had left Egypt under that tyranny of the Pharaoh, it takes quite a mind to make the decision to go into the wilderness, to take all that one holds dear and to risk losing it. And when I say all that one holds dear, I don't mean material goods, although those may also be lost, but surely those are probably mostly left behind when they left Egypt, or when somebody chooses to go into the wilderness. Surely they leave most of that behind even before they enter into the wild. What I mean is close connection. It's family ties, relational ties. What I mean is emotional ties to the self. Grounding of the self to the world, to reality. The physical loss of home, not necessarily the physical structure, but the location on earth for which one can reliably return to, and they know and understand that their family will reliably return to that place as well. And in the word dwell, I think there is, if not more irony, I think that there is this subtle, purposeful contradiction. Perhaps contradiction is not the right word, but there is an element of that, and I think that is true. There is certainly a contra within this relationship between dwell and wilderness. For to dwell in the wilderness, when I think of dwell, I think back to what I was saying about the the home and that stability. The definition for dwell is to live in or at a specified place. The wilderness is not a specified place. When we think of the wilderness, we could think of the forest on the doorstep. And to a degree, that conceptualization of the forest is a location, but the wild and the wilderness certainly is not. It encompasses a large spread of land and of territory, and of the wild in general. As I mentioned, it can exist within the heart of our centers of perceived stability within a corrupt society, within a corrupt city, that could be just as wild as any wilderness. We also have to consider that the word dwell and its extended meaning in terms of reflection, of thinking, and it is an extension of this specified place of mind that one goes to. Now, if we imagine the wilderness to come into mind, it is something that is chaotic, uncertain, again, unstable. And just as I have talked before about the fractal structure of this, I've often referred to the Russian doll, in which you have one form that is repeated at varying degrees of different sizes, and yet the form remains the same. Each one of these is at a different level or layer, perhaps, of experience. And in terms of the wilderness that comes into mind, it comes into any dwelling of man, his home, his family, again, his conscious state. That wilderness can be of any varying degrees. I think all of us, just as I've made this recognition in verses prior, that the wilderness, the periphery, the marginal is a part of our experience. There's no way around it. We can have the most solid of centers, but undoubtedly, undeniably, at our periphery, there will be something for which we are uncertain of, for which tempts us, that is something that is a part of our experience that doesn't belong in the center. And it doesn't necessarily mean that what is at the periphery, or that which is marginal, is evil or wicked. I think it can be. I think that the evil and wicked prosper quite well at the margin. And there's a certain aspect of marginality that is an outgrowth of judicial decisions. We would wish to marginalize or peripheralize the evil aspects of our society, such that we keep them away from view, we keep them away from important structural pillars of society, we keep them out of our institutions, we put them in prisons. There are also aspects of the marginal or the peripheral or of the wild that is just not necessarily evil by nature, again, nor wicked by nature, nor the outcome of some judicial proceeding, but rather just a way of things. Rather, it is a state in which a man would not wish to dwell in such an uncertain environment. They would perhaps do so temporarily if they were on some journey. They may wish to occupy a particular aspect of the wilderness so that they can escape the corrupt center. All of this stuff I've sort of gone through. And I think there is even more about the wilderness. Perhaps there is this good aspect that I haven't discovered. And perhaps one potential that this good aspect is or produces is a type of affordance. Now, exactly what it affords is difficult to say, but because of the lack of constraints and the various elements that are chaotic and moving past one another, I think that there is certain types of movement that is possible within the periphery that is not possible within the center. Now, having said that, perhaps I should say one more thing before I move on. That in the case of a corrupt center, when, as I've mentioned, perhaps it is necessary to forgo the safety, the comfort, and security of the institutions of old, and enter into that uncertain phase or stage. It is possible within the wilderness to plant a new seed, to make order out of that which is chaotic. And in that way, I think we do see a type of affordance, that the wilderness is always there for this escape route, for liberation to be rediscovered. But if we are to back up a little bit and focus again on this word dwell, I'm reminded of an experience that I had not too long ago, in which this situation of the wilderness finding, or rather my dwelling, finding itself within the wilderness. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it meant was a profound period of instability. There were periods of stability, surely. There were moments where the storm clouds cleared and I could see and appreciate a stable future, but it was only momentarily. I knew that around the corner would be another difficult day, another difficult situation, for which I knew that these things, these challenges, they were to confront me such that as I would find them, I would be prompted to consider, or to rediscover, or to build something stable, something around which my mind would find solace, perhaps. Comfort to a degree, but comfort certainly would not be the defining pillar. It is barely a load-bearing wall, this comfort. Belonging certainly would be up there. Now, this sort of experience, this jumping off of a cliff, essentially, a psychological cliff, is such a strange experience. I can think of it now, and the image that is produced in my mind every once in a while. I haven't experienced this all that much, but when one experiences it, one remembers when there is a thunderstorm that is on the horizon, and there is a clear line between the lighter clouds and the dark, almost black-gray clouds of the thunderstorm that are rolling in. And there's this eerie contrast between the two. And you know that the condition of the one is over, and the condition of the chaotic is coming in. But it is this sort of before moment, this sort of a disembodied moment in which one is reflecting on the change between the two states. And this is much like something that I have experienced personally. And when the storm clouds rolled in, of course, from point A to point B, it was entirely different. My dwelling changed entirely. my state of mind, my orientation to reality, it was all fundamentally shifted a few degrees, perhaps many degrees, off of the axis. It is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman. So to purposefully leap into a place of chaos or uncertainty, to avoid contention and anger, let's put the woman aside for a moment. Now, a contention is a heated disagreement, an argument stemming from more fundamentals, which we might say to strive or to struggle. Of the word strive, we have to make a great effort to achieve or obtain something. Of struggle, we have make forceful or violent efforts to get free of restraint or constriction. So if we put all of these pieces together, and we have a conscious effort to divide, in a sense, to put forth a great effort such that the restraints that are, perhaps we can consider the center in this case, are broken, they are disrupted, they are always in dispute. Now, I don't find much difference between that condition and the condition one may find themselves in the wilderness. Now, there's more to be said because anger is along with this here. Now, from a few verses ago, the concept of anger came up. And I had discussed that anger was something of a sophisticated emotion, that it included reason, and that anger in and of itself was not the fundamental product of the heart. Although tied closely to it, for we call it an emotion, but anger is something that is directed. Something that is felt but undirected, we might say, is opposition, irritability. These are perhaps emotions that are not necessarily directed. They're just sort of experienced. There may be a reason for them, but they can be experienced without a reason. Anger is one of these that I have decided to define as one of these for which includes the fundamental element, but also is wed to some reason, some logical chain. And so it's as if the wilderness, instead of being a state that is outside of the self, is almost used as a weapon by somebody else to cudgel whoever is reading this, to use all of the same forces that one might find in the wilderness, but to use them in such a way that dissolves their core, dissolves their center. It dissolves their core understanding, their relationship to the world, to reality. For what purpose, it's not stated here. Now the question is, of what importance is it that it is a woman? Are we to imagine that every word that is read here must be read from the point of view of a man? Or can this be interpreted from both sides, that if a woman was reading this, she would be able to come to some conclusion specific to the contentious and angry woman, because undeniably her relationship to this woman, it would be different. From a man, we sort of expect that our relation to this woman is some romantic relationship, some relationship that is beyond that of just a friendship, but rather the specific and unique type of relationship that a man and a woman can share together. Now, from the perspective of a woman, or since I'm a man, I can imagine that if what is said here, it is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry man, the way that I would see this verse would be a bit different. And I would imagine for a woman reading this verse, it would be quite different as well. And so I think it's worthwhile going down that road. And all the while, I recognize that there are those marginal few that would consider a type of relationship that transgresses a certain boundary, that they would share woman to woman, but I don't necessarily think that that's necessary to explore. Now, in the case of a woman seeing this verse, the deepest form of relationship that a woman perhaps can have to another woman is that of understanding like understanding like. Understanding the role or the woman's place in the world and in reality. Just as a man would and can understand his place and his role in society and in experience in general. That he carries the seed with him to propagate life, and the woman receives the seed and cultivates and grows that seed. Of course, they together have that shared experience of growing and cultivating. But of the woman, if we are to identify the receiving nature, the nurturing nature. Now, of nurture, from the Latin, we have the meaning to suckle, to nourish, or to support. And when I say of the Latin, I mean of the Latin root of the word. And if we take specifically the word support and nourish, we are talking about a form of the center. That at the core of the woman there is this core of the center that is possible. What does that mean, that core of the center? Well, the core of the center is something that supports, by virtue of what it is. It's like a load-bearing beam. I was in a friend's crawl space the other day, and there's a few large I-beams that go across that space to hold up the house. That is a supporting structure. It provides a supporting role. It takes on and it carries the load of something else. That is its purpose and its responsibility. And for the woman, that purpose and responsibility comes down through the possibility of, or being capable of nourishing, such that the I-beam is not only, it's potentially not only to be used in a house, it could be used in any number of different structural analogies. Likewise, it doesn't necessarily have to be used in my friend's house. It could be easily taken from there and used in another situation. Now, it would be at the expense of the integrity of my friend's house, certainly, but it could be done. Or we can imagine the situation before it was even placed there. We can imagine a situation before it was even molded into an I-beam. And we can imagine all the different types of ways that that iron could be shaped and used, utilized to support the various material structure of our society. Likewise, a woman, I think, finds herself in a unique position that she can use that to shape, form, and mold a child in whichever way she sees fit. And I think these days, to say such a thing and to restrict the woman's purpose towards childbearing can seem almost immoral. But I think it is perhaps the highest virtue of a woman to be able to accept such a responsibility. Now, moving away from this support and entering into the word of nourishment or sustenance, we are sustaining, much like we sustain ourselves. We don't do so for arbitrary reasons. We try to do so for particular purposes. We feel that our behavior and our experience is worthwhile, and we make an effort to participate in the world and to experience. All the while, we must nourish ourselves. We must continue to sustain ourselves. Part of that means sacrificing our time and our energy towards something that would allow the propagation of existence to continue. And the woman has this profound capacity to do so for the next wave of human beings. That she is the soul carrier of the human being when she receives that seed. Now, I think this is particularly important to think about it in terms of man's relationship to a woman, but since we are down the path of the woman to woman, this woman, in that sense, would be this perverting element. That the woman who is in some sort of relationship with this person, whether it be a friend or this woman is a part of her family or something, or of her close community, this person potentially would wish to have the seed of opposition and destruction sown within her, such that she would break down, separate, differentiate the principles that cause or allow us to be and to hold a degree of stability. And for that corrupting influence to enter into the mind of another woman, I think is terrible. It's terrible because she may take the responsibility of having a child. And if she takes in enough of this information, enough of this way of being, this contentious nature, she will pass that disease down to her offspring. That life is nothing but a quarrel. There's nothing but a dissension. It is nothing but a dispute. Not that disputes and contention aren't part of our experience. They certainly are, and they can be beneficial. But contention for the sake of contention will only breed further contention and dispute. It would never be a dispute in order to come to some greater understanding. It would be a dispute all the way down into ultimate destruction and disunity, into that wilderness. And of course, if a man was reading this, he would consider his relationship to that woman. That if he is to be received by her, he would be received into the womb of separation, the lack of support. It would be the expression, the cutting of one's legs out from underneath them, such that now this man is unable to stand on his 2 feet. And if he is to bring offspring forth into the world, they too would have this quality. They would do that. They would do it to themselves. They would do it to their father. They would do it to the people that they meet in their lives. And so better it would be to willfully go into the unknown rather than to, perhaps I should rephrase, it's better to go into the unknown and risk the uncertainty and the potential of this dissension or contentious nature as being an aspect of the wilderness, or to be with this person and just face it head on, which would inevitably lead to the destruction of the family. And so surely we can see here that the sacrifice is risking the potential, but also the possibility of planting a new seed and building new supports in the wilderness. So I'm going to end this episode here. I'll continue next time with verse 20.